Jamila was restocking the bottom shelf when the bell above the door rang and the air in the shop changed. Not a sound, a feeling. The specific quality of stillness that settles over a space when something that does not belong in it has just walked through the door. She did not look up immediately. That was the whole point of the performance she had been perfecting for 2 years. The unhurried movements, the hands that kept working, the woman so unremarkable in her routine that no one looked twice. She finished aligning the row she was working on. Then she stood and turned around. He was already at the counter. Black suit, immaculate. An undercut sharp enough to have been done that morning. A neck tattoo climbing toward his jaw, the kind of ink that is not decoration but biography. 2 associates behind him, spread apart with the practiced spacing of men who do this professionally, one near the door, one just behind his right shoulder. She clocked them both in a single glance and filed them completely away. Seojun leaned forward across the wooden counter. Too far. Deliberate. The posture of a man who has spent his entire life using physical space to remind people of the distance between what he is and what they are. He looked at her the way certain kinds of men look at things they have already decided do not matter. Then he spoke. Not in standard Korean. Not even in the regional variation she heard occasionally from the older customers in the neighborhood. He went somewhere else entirely, somewhere old and coastal and almost extinct. A dialect from a small island off the southern coast that most Korean nationals have never heard spoken aloud in their lifetimes. A linguistic artifact. A dead language still walking. He used it like a blade. The words he chose were a threat dressed in syllables he was absolutely certain she could not parse. The point was not the content. The point was the performance of her confusion, the blank face, the lost expression, the confirmation that she was exactly what she appeared to be. A woman in an apron, behind a register, in a small shop that smelled like sesame oil and old wood. He was already smiling before he finished the sentence. Jamila set her restocking cloth down on the counter. Slowly, without hurry, she looked at him directly. And then, in the exact same dialect, same cadence, same register, sharper grammar, she said 7 words that made one associate step backward, made the other one go completely blank, and made Seojun's smile leave his face so fast it was like watching something fall. The shop went the kind of silent that has nothing to do with the absence of noise and everything to do with the sudden, total rearrangement of power in a room. Seojun did not move for 4 full seconds. Seojun, who ran operations across 3 countries, who had not been surprised by anything in longer than he could remember, who walked into every room already knowing how it ended, stood behind a wooden grocery counter in a neighborhood shop and had absolutely nothing to say. Jamila tilted her head. Just slightly. Just enough to be polite about it. Was there something you needed? You stopped for the story. Out of everything competing for your attention today, you stopped here. Maybe that is not an accident. Because this is not just a story about a man who walked into the wrong shop. This is a story about what happens when a woman who has spent 2 years making herself invisible is finally seen by exactly the person she should never have been visible to, and what she does with that. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, if you have ever been counted out, written off, looked past, then you already understand something about Jamila before I've told you a single thing about her past. Hit subscribe. Turn on your notifications. Because what comes after that counter, after those 7 words, after the silence that swallowed that shop whole, it will not disappoint you. Now, let me tell you who Jamila actually is, and why a Korean mafia boss spent 3 years looking for her grandmother. Jamila had a system. 5:45 in the morning, up before the neighborhood. 6 o'clock, unlock the front door, flip the sign, start the coffee on the small machine behind the register that had belonged to her grandmother and that she had repaired herself 3 times rather than replace. 6:15. Restock the bottom shelf near the window, the one that always ran low on dried fish crackers and the small bags of roasted nuts the morning commuters grabbed without slowing down. 7 o'clock. Greet Mr. Osei from the apartment building across the street, who came in every single morning for a bottle of water and a copy of a newspaper she special ordered for him, and who had never once asked her a personal question in 2 years, which was one of the reasons she liked him so much. 8 o'clock. Inventory. 9 o'clock. Wipe every surface until the shop smelled like lemon and order and the specific neutrality of a space that had nothing to hide. Routine. That was the entire point. Routine meant unremarkable. Unremarkable meant invisible. Invisible meant safe. The shop itself was not much to look at. Narrow aisles. Wooden shelving her grandmother had built herself, leaning slightly left in the way of things made by hand and kept too long. A cash register with its own opinions. Hand-lettered price tags in her own handwriting. A single overhead light that buzzed faintly when rain was coming. She knew where everything lived. She knew which floorboard creaked, second from the door, lean right, and she knew the exact quality of silence that settled over the shop at 2 in the afternoon when the neighborhood exhaled and foot traffic died, and she could exist briefly without performing anything at all. She had built that silence. She intended to keep it. 2 years ago, Jamila had a different life. A real one, the kind with a name attached to it and a trajectory that other people could see. She had spent the better part of a decade building expertise in a field that did not make it easy for women who looked like her to be taken seriously, and she had done it anyway, through a combination of precision and patience, and the specific stubbornness of a person who was raised to finish what she started. She was good at what she did. Not in the way people say, as encouragement. Genuinely, demonstrably, undeniably good. And then someone decided that was a problem. It came apart the way these things always come apart when someone with resources wants them to, not loudly, not suddenly, but through the slow accumulation of doubt. Documents she had never seen attributed to her. A narrative built from just enough truth to make the lies load-bearing. By the time she understood the scale of what was happening, the people she had worked alongside for years were already deciding how to distance themselves. Not because they believed it, necessarily. Because belief was not required. Plausibility was enough. She never learned who built it. Not then. So she disappeared. Traded her name for an apron. Signed a lease on a tired grocery shop in a neighborhood 2 cities from where she had lived before, a shop that had been her grandmother Adi's, that had sat empty for 8 months after Adi's died, and that Jamila had taken not because it made practical sense, but because it was the only thing left that felt like something solid to hold on to. She learned the shop the way she had learned everything she was good at, completely, with total attention. She also spent the long, quiet hours learning other things. Her grandmother had spoken a dialect to her throughout her childhood, the particular sound of a coastal island language that Jamila had always assumed was simply Adi's private eccentricity, the way old women hold onto the sounds of the places that shaped them. When Jamila found herself with time and anger and nowhere productive to direct either, she went deep into it. Found a linguistics archive. Found an elderly speaker willing to teach remotely. Filled 2 notebooks. Learned the grammar underneath the grammar, the historical syntax, the register shifts, the things the language did that standard Korean did not. She did it because it connected her to her grandmother. She did it because it gave the anger somewhere to go. She did not do it because she expected it to ever be useful. She had been behind that counter for 2 years when Seo-jun walked in the first time. Alone, without his associates, moving through her aisles slowly with the particular attention of a man reading a room rather than shopping in one. He bought almost nothing. He left without incident. She noticed everything. She said nothing. She told herself she was simply being careful. She told herself she had been careful for 2 years, and it had kept her safe, and there was no reason to believe that a man in an expensive suit moving too deliberately through a small grocery shop was anything more than an anomaly. She told herself that for 6 days. Then, he came back. And this time he brought company. Seo-jun had been having the kind of month that recalibrated a person's understanding of what a bad month actually meant. It started with a name that surfaced in a conversation he was not supposed to hear, spoken by a person he had trusted for 3 years, in a context that made everything Seo-jun thought he understood about the last 3 years rearrange itself in a matter of seconds. Woo-jin. Seo-jun had believed Woo-jin was dead. He had grieved him as dead, which was its own specific kind of damage, the grief of losing someone you considered a brother to violence you blamed yourself for not preventing. Woo-jin had been his closest lieutenant, the person inside his organization who had his complete trust, and 3 years ago a series of targeted attacks had killed 4 of Seo-jun's people and nearly killed Seo-jun himself. Woo-jin had been reported among the dead. Seo-jun had carried that. What he had not known, what the conversation he was not supposed to hear confirmed with cold precision, was that Woo-jin was not dead. Woo-jin had engineered the attacks, had fed the information that made them possible, had staged his own death and disappeared with the one piece of evidence that could expose the full network of his betrayal, a ledger kept for years as insurance, containing documentation that implicated not just Woo-jin but the rival organization he had been feeding. Seo-jun had spent 3 years looking for that ledger. 3 years following threads that went cold. 3 years carrying grief for a man who was alive and laughing somewhere at the efficiency of his own disappearance. The thread that had not gone cold, the one that had led Seo-jun, eventually, to a neighborhood grocery shop in a city far from the one where all of it began, was a name. A woman who had known Woo-jin in the coastal village where they both grew up. A woman who had left Korea quietly decades ago, and who several people who were very careful about what they said had become very careful about not mentioning. Her name was Adiz. Seo-jun had found the shop. He had come alone the first time to read it, to understand what he was dealing with before deciding how to approach it. What he found was a woman who noticed him noticing her, and did not look away. That was the first thing that made him recalibrate. He came back the second time with a test. A trap, efficient and certain. The dialect as a weapon. A way of confirming she was simply a shopkeeper, that whatever her grandmother had been, she was not a complication. He had been wrong about many things in his life. He had never been wrong quite like this. The shop smelled like sesame oil and old wood and something underneath both of those things that Jamila had never been able to name, something that was simply Adiz, the specific atmosphere of a woman who had occupied a space so completely and for so long that she had become part of its structure. Jamila had grown up in this shop. Not lived in it. Her grandmother kept a small apartment on the floor above, but grown up in it the way you grow up in the place that shapes you, the place where you learned what work looked like, and what dignity looked like, and what it meant to be of use to the people around you. Adiz had opened it 31 years ago with a lease she could barely cover, and shelving she built herself from reclaimed wood, and a stubbornness that Jamila had inherited so completely she sometimes could not tell where her grandmother ended and she began. The neighborhood had fed itself from these shelves for 3 decades. That was not a small thing. Jamila thought about that on the difficult days, and there were difficult days, more of them recently, when the numbers did not cooperate and the landlord's emails arrived with the specific tone of a man who had already decided what he wanted the building to become and was simply waiting for her to stop being an obstacle to it. The lease renewal had been stalled for 4 months. The property group that now owned the building had a name that sounded institutional and a responsiveness that suggested they were in no hurry to resolve anything in her favor. Adiz had left her the shop and its debts in equal measure. Jamila had accepted both without hesitation because the alternative, letting it close, letting 30 years of her grandmother's life become a vacancy that some other interest filled, was not something she was capable of choosing. So she stayed. She managed. She made the numbers work through a combination of precision and the kind of creative accounting that is not dishonest so much as optimistic. She was good at keeping things alive. She had learned from an expert. What Adiz had not left her, what had always sat at the edge of her grandmother's story, like a room with the door left slightly open, was the full account of the years before the shop. Before this city. Before the life Jamila had always known her to inhabit so completely that it was impossible to imagine her outside of it. Adiz spoke about her past the way certain people speak about weather in a country they no longer live in, occasionally without detail, with the careful selectiveness of someone who has decided which parts of a story belong to the telling and which parts belong only to them. The photograph was in the stockroom, nailed to the back wall behind the oldest shelving unit, in a frame that had been there so long the wood around it had darkened in its shape. A coastal village, stone and water and gray sky. A younger Adiz, maybe 30, standing with the particular uprightness of someone newly certain of herself. And beside her, a man whose face had been torn away. Not faded. Not damaged by time. Torn. Deliberately, cleanly, by someone who had made a decision about what should not be remembered. Jamila had looked at that photograph her entire life. She had never once asked her grandmother about it. She understood now that she should have. It was a Tuesday. Mid-morning, the slow hour between the breakfast commuters and the lunch crowd, when the shop settled into the particular quiet that Jamila used for restocking and thinking and the small administrative tasks that kept everything running beneath the surface. The bell above the door rang, and she noted it without looking up. Tuesdays at this hour were usually regulars. Mrs. Okafor for her weekly supply of dried crayfish, the young man from the studio apartment on the 4th floor who bought the same energy drink every 2 days with the consistency of someone medicating. She knew the rhythm of her customers the way she knew the floorboards. By sound, by pattern, by the small deviations that told her when something was different. This was different. She looked up. He was already 3 steps inside, moving toward the first aisle with a slowness that had nothing to do with browsing. There is a specific quality to the way people move through a shop when they are looking for something, a directed energy, however casual, that pulls them toward a section. This man had none of that. He moved through the space the way you move through a room you are reading rather than occupying. His eyes went to the shelving, the layout, the back wall, the register, the door to the stockroom. Methodical, unhurried, thorough in a way that was not about groceries. He was dressed in a way that was wrong for the shop and wrong for the neighborhood, not ostentatiously, but with the precise understatement of someone whose clothes cost more than the monthly revenue of the businesses on this street. Dark jacket, open collar, a watch that caught the overhead light once and that she did not look at twice because looking twice would have meant something. The tattoo on his neck was visible above the collar. Not hidden. Not displayed. Simply present, the way everything about him was simply present, as though he had long ago stopped making accommodations for how other people received him. He picked up 2 items in the course of 10 minutes. A small jar of something from the imported goods section. A bottle of water from the cooler near the door. He brought them to the counter without any of the small social performances that customers usually arrived with. No eye contact offered, no pleasantry attempted, none of the unconscious theater of a person completing a transaction in a neighborhood shop. He paid. He left. The bell rang again, and the shop was exactly as it had been before he entered. Jamila stood at the register for a moment after the door closed. Her hands were still. Her face was composed. She was very good at composed. She told herself he was simply a man who had wandered in. Someone from outside the neighborhood, passing through. Nothing more than an anomaly in a Tuesday morning that was otherwise ordinary. She had spent 2 years developing an excellent instinct for what was safe and what was not. Every single part of that instinct was telling her the same thing. She did not believe it for a moment. He came back on a Friday. This time, he was not alone. 3 associates, the configuration she had already learned to read as deliberate rather than incidental. 1 near the door before it had fully closed. 1 moving to the far end of the aisle with the practiced drift of someone covering an angle. The 3rd staying close, just behind Seojin's right shoulder, with a specific quality of attention that meant he was not there for the shopping either. Seojin moved to the counter directly. No browsing this time, no reading of the room. He had already done that Tuesday, filed it, finished with it. He placed 2 items on the counter with the efficiency of a man completing a step in a sequence rather than making a purchase, and Jamila began the transaction with the same composed steadiness she brought to everything. Her hands moved. The register responded. She did not perform comfort, and she did not perform fear, and she kept her eyes at the level of his collarbone the way she had learned to keep herself neutral in the presence of things she had not yet categorized. He said something to the associate at his shoulder. She processed the first word and a half before her hands slowed on the register. It was not standard Korean. It was not even the regional variation she sometimes heard from the older residents near the eastern end of the neighborhood. It went somewhere beneath all of that, somewhere old and coastal and specific in the way that only things shaped by extreme geographic isolation become specific. The vowel shifts. The consonant clusters that do not exist in any mainland form of the language. The particular rhythm of it. The cadence that her grandmother had used when she was tired or emotional, or simply not performing anything for anyone, when she forgot, briefly, that she had left that island behind. Jamila knew exactly what it was. She also knew, in the same instant, exactly what it was being used for. The words themselves were unremarkable, a short directive to his associate, nothing that required this dialect to communicate. The dialect was not the message. The dialect was the test. The point was her face. The blank, uncomprehending face of a woman who was hearing sound without meaning. The confirmation that she was simply a shopkeeper behind a counter who could be spoken around freely and safely because she had no access to whatever was being said. She processed all of this in approximately 2 seconds. And then, without deciding to, without a single moment of strategic consideration, purely because her grandmother's voice lived in her body at a level below thought, she responded. In the same dialect, same register. The correction came out of her before she had chosen it. His grammar had been slightly wrong. She told him so. The shop went silent in the specific way of a room where the atmosphere has just changed completely, and everyone present is waiting to understand what that means. The associate near the door stopped moving. The one behind Seojin's shoulder looked at him with an expression she had never seen on the face of a man in that position, something close to uncertainty, looking to him for instruction and finding none available. Seojin did not move. 4 seconds. She counted them without meaning to, the way you count things when the world has gone strange, and your body is looking for something measurable to hold on to. He stood completely still behind her grandmother's wooden counter, in her grandmother's shop, surrounded by the smell of sesame oil and old wood and 30 years of a life he had been hunting the edges of, and for the first time in longer than she imagined he could remember, he had nothing prepared for what came next. Jamila tilted her head. Just enough. Was there something you needed? He did not leave. That was the first thing. The associates looked at him for direction, and he gave it with 2 words she didn't catch and a movement of his hand that was less a gesture than a punctuation mark, final, unhurried, requiring no confirmation. The one near the door went first. The one at the far aisle followed. The third, the one who had been closest, held his position for half a second longer than the others, just long enough to communicate that he had reservations, and then he too was gone, and the bell above the door rang once, and was quiet. Seojun looked at her steadily across the counter. Where did you learn it? No preamble. No performance of casualness. The question landed with the directness of someone who has decided that the usual approach is no longer relevant to this particular situation. My grandmother, Jamila said. She spoke it every day. I grew up hearing it. Something moved through the processing behind his eyes. He was working with the information in real time, fitting it against something she could not see the shape of yet. Your grandmother's name, he said. It was technically a question. It did not entirely sound like one. Jamila considered him for a moment, not the hesitation of someone uncertain whether to answer, but the deliberate pause of a woman deciding how much of her own posture to reveal before she understood more about what she was dealing with. Adiz, she said. She watched his face. What moved across it was not simple recognition, not the clean flash of a name connecting to a memory. It was something that lived in the complicated territory between recognition and grief, and something older than both of them that she did not yet have a name for. It lasted only a moment. Then his face returned to its default composure, the practiced stillness of a man who has spent years ensuring that his reactions belong only to him. But she had seen it. And he knew she had seen it. He moved around to the customer side of the counter and sat down on the wooden stool her grandmother had kept there for the older regulars who needed to rest mid-conversation. He sat without asking, without apology, with the complete ease of a man rearranging the furniture of a situation to suit what it had now become. Jamila folded her arms and waited. The questions came with precision, her grandmother's history, how long ago she had come to the city, whether Jamila had known her in Korea, whether Adiz had ever spoken about a specific stretch of years before she left the island. Each question placed with the care of someone who knew exactly where he was going and was managing the pace of arrival. Jamila answered what she chose to answer. And then she stopped. You recognized her name, she said. I need to know why. He looked at her with the specific attention of a man recalibrating his expectations of who he is sitting across from. She knew someone I knew, he said. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. The shop was very quiet. Outside, the neighborhood moved past the window without noticing that anything had shifted. Jamila kept her eyes on his face and did not move and did not soften and did not give him the exit of her looking away first. He told her more than he had planned to. She could see that too, the slight recalibration mid-sentence, the point where the prepared version of what he was saying gave way to something closer to the actual thing. He told her about a man, about a betrayal, about 3 years of following threads that dissolved before he could close his hand around them, about an island and a woman who had left it suddenly and a piece of something that had disappeared with her. He did not tell her everything, but what he told her was real. When he finished, the silence between them had a different quality than the one before he started. Heavier, more specifically shaped. My grandmother never spoke about Korea, Jamila said. Not directly. Not in detail. I know, he said. And the way he said it, quietly, without satisfaction, told her that he had known this before he walked through her door, and that it had not been enough to stop him from looking. He did not tell her all of it that first afternoon. He came back the following day, and the day after that, and the full shape of it assembled itself across 3 conversations the way certain truths do, not in a single disclosure but in layers, each one only possible because the one before it had been received without flinching. This is what she learned. 3 years ago, Seojun's organization had been moving through a period of consolidation, the kind of internal restructuring that requires absolute trust among the people closest to you, because the vulnerabilities it creates are significant, and the window during which they exist is exploitable by anyone who knows where to look. Woojin knew where to look. He had been with Seojun since they were young men on the same island, the same neighborhood, the same understanding of how the world was organized and what it took to move through it without being consumed by it. He was not simply a lieutenant. He was the person Seo-jun had built the inner architecture of his trust around. The one who knew everything. Which meant that when Wu Jin began feeding information to a rival organization, carefully, selectively, over a period of months, the damage was not incidental. It was precise, targeted at exactly the points that would cause the most irreversible harm. For people died. Seo-jun did not say their names in sequence, but Jamila understood from the way he carried the number that he knew each one completely. Their faces, their histories, what they had been doing the moment the information Wu Jin sold was used against them. One of them was his younger brother. He said this without inflection. The absence of inflection was its own kind of weight, and Jamila did not try to fill it with anything. Wu Jin disappeared before he could be found. Staged it thoroughly. A death that was plausible enough to close the immediate question while he rebuilt himself somewhere unreachable. Seo-jun had spent 3 years pulling at threads that dissolved before he could close his hand around them. The rival organization that had used Wu Jin's information was protected by layers of corporate insulation and the specific safety of people who know they are holding documentation that keeps them alive. That documentation was the ledger. Wu Jin had kept records for years. Names, transactions, the full architecture of his double-dealing, not out of conscience but out of the same cold pragmatism that had defined everything he did. Insurance. A guarantee that if he was ever found, he was not the only one exposed. He had given it to someone for safekeeping before he disappeared. Someone outside the organization, outside the city, outside any network that could be easily traced or pressured. Someone from the island. Someone he had trusted decades before trust had become a transaction. The thread had led Seo-jun here. To this neighborhood. To this shop. To a woman named Adiz who had left the island quietly 30 years ago and never come back. He looked at Jamila across the counter with the steady, exhausted certainty of a man who has been carrying something for 3 years and has just found the last door it might open. I don't know if she knew what she was holding, he said, but I need to know if it is still here. She closed the shop the next morning and did not reopen it. She turned the sign, drew the inner curtain across the door glass, and stood in the quiet of the closed shop for a long moment before she did anything else. The neighborhood continued outside the window without her. Footsteps, a delivery vehicle, Mrs. Okafor's voice carrying from somewhere down the street, and Jamila stood inside the stillness she had built and thought about everything Seo-jun had told her and what it meant about the woman who had raised her. She went to the stockroom first. Not to search, not yet, but to stand in front of the photograph the way she had stood in front of it 1,000 times before, except now with different eyes. The coastal village, gray and stone and water. Her grandmother young and certain of herself in a way that Jamila recognized because she had inherited it. And the man beside her, face torn away with the clean deliberateness of a decision rather than an accident. She had always assumed the torn face was a private grief. A relationship that had ended badly, an old wound her grandmother had chosen not to carry visually. She understood now that it might have been something more careful than that. Not the erasure of a memory, but the protection of an identity. The removal of a face that, if recognized by the wrong person, might have connected her grandmother to something she had worked very hard to be unreachable from. Jamila set the photograph down and began to search. She did it the way she did everything, methodically, without sentiment, moving through the shop from back to front with the complete attention of a woman who knows a space thoroughly and is now looking at it for the first time. She checked the places that made structural sense. The hollow spaces. The seams between built-in elements and walls. The underside of fixed shelving. The areas her grandmother had always maintained herself, refusing help, refusing replacement, insisting on the continued existence of things that most people would have discarded years ago. The shelving unit in the stockroom was the last thing Adiz had ever let anyone suggest replacing. The conversation had happened twice in Jamila's memory, two separate occasions, two separate practical reasons offered, and both times her grandmother had closed the subject with a finality that did not invite further discussion. Jamila understood that now, too. She found it in the hollow base, built into the structure so completely that it had become part of it. The join between the false bottom and the frame seamless with age and the specific intention of someone who had placed it there to stay. An oilcloth package, sealed with the kind of thoroughness that suggested it had been prepared for a long wait. The cloth had darkened with time, but held. Whatever was inside had been protected against 30 years of a shop's accumulated atmosphere with the care of someone who understood what they were preserving. She carried it to the small table near the window and set it down, and did not open it. She sat with it for a long time. The shop dark around her, the neighborhood quieting outside, the photograph on the table beside the package, because she had brought it without deciding to. She thought about Adiz, not the grandmother she had known, the woman in the apron behind this same counter, steady and warm and carefully selective about what she shared, but the younger woman in the photograph. The woman who had stood on a Korean island beside a man whose face she would later remove with her own hands. The woman who had carried something across an ocean and built an entire life around keeping it safe and unreachable. Who had spoken in a dying dialect to her granddaughter every single day, perhaps because she loved its sound, perhaps because she understood that language was a kind of inheritance, and she was preparing Jamila for something without being able to say so directly. And then she thought about Siajan's face when she said Adiz's name. Not the composure that followed. The moment before it, the unguarded half-second when something moved through him that was too large and too old to fully contain. The grief in it. The recognition. The specific weight of a man who had been looking for something for 3 years and had just heard a word that told him he was finally in the right place. She sat with the package in her hands until the street outside went fully quiet.
She did not open it that night, but she already knew she was going to.
He came back the following morning alone, at the hour before she officially opened. She had not told him to come at that hour. He came anyway, which told her something about the precision with which he was tracking the shape of this situation. She let him in without a word and turned back toward the counter, and he followed, and they stood on opposite sides of it in the gray early light with the shop still dim around them, and Jamila looked at him directly and said it plainly. "I found something." He went completely still. Not the performed stillness of a man managing his reaction. The actual stillness of a person whose entire system has just redirected itself toward a single point. She watched it move through him and settle. Where? His voice was level, careful in a way that cost him something. The shelving unit in the stockroom. The base. He said nothing. He was waiting, she understood, with the discipline of a man who has learned that speaking into certain silences closes them prematurely. "I haven't opened it," she said. "And I haven't told anyone." He nodded once. "I'm not going to hand you anything," she continued, "until I understand completely what my grandmother was involved in. Why she had it. What it means for me that it has been sitting in this building for 30 years. And whether giving it to you puts me in more danger than keeping it does." She had rehearsed none of this. It came out with the clean directness of someone who has spent a night arriving at exactly what they need to say, and is now simply saying it. Seojun looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the stool on the customer side of the counter, her grandmother's stool, and sat down, and folded his hands on the wooden surface, and began. He did not deflect a single question. She noted that carefully because she was watching for it. The pivot, the partial answer dressed as a complete one, the management of information that powerful people deployed so reflexively they often didn't know they were doing it. It did not come. What came instead was this. Adiz had not taken anything. She had been given the package by a man inside Seojin's organization, a senior figure, someone who had begun to suspect Wu Jin months before the betrayal became undeniable, who had understood that any documentation kept within reach of the organization was documentation Wu Jin could access or destroy. He had needed someone completely outside every network. Someone Wu Jin trusted from before, from the island, from the life before all of it, and who had, crucially, removed herself from that world so completely that she would never appear in any calculation of where to look. He had asked Adiz to hold it. She had said yes. She had known what she was holding. She had understood the risk. And she had built 30 years of ordinary, unremarkable life around keeping it exactly where it needed to be, safe, undisturbed, waiting. Jamila stood with that for a long moment. The full weight of it. Not the grandmother she had grieved, the woman in the apron and the hand-lettered price tags and the daily ritual of a shop that fed a neighborhood, but the woman underneath that woman. The one who had made a decision decades ago that required extraordinary steadiness to maintain, and had maintained it completely, without ever saying a word. She had raised Jamila in this shop. She had spoken the dialect to her every day. She had refused to let anyone replace the shelving unit. She had been preparing, in her own quiet way, for exactly this. Jamila looked at Seojun across the counter. He met her eyes without pressure, without urgency, with the patience of a man who understood that this moment belonged to her and not to him. She pushed off from the counter and walked to the stockroom without a word. She retrieved the package and brought it back and set it on the wooden surface between them. She did not open it for him. She set it on the counter between them and stepped back and let him do it himself, because whatever was inside had been her grandmother's to keep and was his to find, and she understood instinctively that the opening of it belonged to that dynamic rather than to her. He worked the oilcloth carefully. Not with urgency, with the deliberate attention of someone who understands that the way you handle a thing communicates what you understand about its weight. The cloth came away in sections, stiff with age, and beneath it was a second layer of wax paper, and beneath that, the contents. She watched his face rather than the package. The ledger was real, a physical book, cloth-bound, its pages dense with columns of notation in a hand she did not recognize. Names, figures, dates going back further than 3 years, the full documented architecture of something that had been built carefully and over a long time. Beside it, folded and ordered with the same precision as the ledger itself, a series of separate pages, testimony sheets, she understood from the way Seojun handled them, each one a standalone record of a specific transaction or communication, each one initialed and dated in a way that made them independently verifiable rather than requiring the ledger to give them meaning. He worked through them with the focused stillness of a man reading something he has needed for 3 years. She did not rush him. She stood on her side of the counter in the gray shop light and let him take the time it required. Then he reached the last item in the package and stopped. A single folded page, separate from the others, placed at the bottom with the intentionality of something saved for last. He opened it. She watched the shift in his posture, subtle, but there, as his eyes moved across the first line. A change in the quality of his stillness. Something opening slightly in a face that kept almost everything closed. He read it fully before he looked up. "It's addressed to whoever found this," he said, after she was gone. He did not offer it to her immediately. He set it on the counter and was quiet for a moment in the way of someone putting something back in order inside themselves before they could continue. He translated it for her, slowly, moving between the standard Korean and the coastal dialect in which parts of it were written, her grandmother's voice, she realized, moving between the two the way she always had, the way Jamila had heard it her entire childhood, without understanding that it was a precision rather than a habit. Adiz had written that she knew exactly what she was holding, that she had understood it from the moment it was placed in her hands, and had never for a single day been confused about what it represented or what it required of her. She had built her life around the keeping of it, not out of fear, but out of the specific conviction that some things, once entrusted to you, become yours to protect absolutely, and that protection was its own form of honor. She wrote that she hoped whoever found it would understand that nothing had been taken, only held, and that she hoped the holding of it, for however long it had taken, would eventually return to the people it had been taken from something of what they had lost. The shop was completely quiet. Jamila looked at Siajan's face and saw, for the first time since he had walked through her door, the full and unguarded version of him, not the composure, not the precision, not the controlled stillness of a man who has learned to keep everything internal and inaccessible. Something beneath all of that, older than the organization, older than the betrayal, older than 3 years of hunting a thread through cities and paper trails and dead ends. A man who had loved his brother, who had loved someone he considered family, and who had just been handed, in the handwriting of a woman he had never met, a letter that understood all of it. She did not say anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. She let him have the moment entirely. Wu Jin was found in 17 days. She did not ask how. Seo Jun did not offer the details, and she did not need them. She understood that there was a version of this story that belonged to his world entirely, and that her not knowing the specifics of it was a form of protection he was extending without being asked. What she knew was the outcome, and the outcome was this. The ledger did exactly what it had been built to do. The documented architecture of Wu Jin's double dealing, combined with the testimony pages, each one independently verifiable, each one a self-contained piece of something that had been constructed with the precision of a man who understood that his own survival depended on the quality of his records, dismantled the insulation that had kept the rival organization unreachable for 3 years. The protection collapsed inward. The people it had been shielding found themselves exposed in ways that left no viable response except the kind of rapid, desperate restructuring that always, in the end, produced more exposure rather than less. Siajan's people were safe. For the first time in 3 years, genuinely, structurally safe, not managed, not held at a careful distance from a threat that was still present, but safe in the way that is only possible when the source of the danger has been removed rather than simply pushed back. Jamila learned about the threat against herself gradually, in the weeks that followed, through the specific texture of its absence. Small things she had not known were in motion stopped moving. A situation she had not known was building resolved without her having to do anything to resolve it. The property group that had been stalling her lease renewal for 6 months, the one with the corporate layering she had never been able to trace to a human decision-maker, sent a new agreement within 3 weeks of Seo Jun leaving her shop with the package. Favorable terms. No explanation for the change. The kind of resolution that does not happen without someone somewhere making a specific decision to allow it. She did not ask Seo Jun directly. He did not confirm it. He came back to the shop on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the last time she had seen him. Alone. No associates, no suit jacket. The collar of his shirt open the way it had been the first day he walked through her door. He bought a coffee from the small machine behind the register, her grandmother's machine, the one she had repaired 3 times, and moved to the small table near the window and sat down. Her grandmother's table. The one Adiz had used every morning for 30 years to drink her own coffee and watch the neighborhood begin its day. He sat there for an hour. He did not conduct business. He did not make calls. He watched the street outside the window with the quality of attention of a man who is not surveilling anything but simply being present in a place that means something to him for reasons he is still in the process of understanding. Jamila moved through her morning routine around him, restocked the bottom shelf, greeted Mr. Osei, wiped every surface until the shop smelled like lemon and order. She did not ask him why he had come or when he was leaving or what this was, because she understood that some things do not have clean answers and that asking for one prematurely closes something that is better left open. Some debts are not paid in words. Some of them are paid in showing up, in being present in a place that almost stopped existing, in sitting at a table that belongs to a woman who kept a 30-year promise she never got credit for, in staying for an hour in an ordinary shop on an ordinary street as though it matters. It mattered. The shop was still standing. The sign in the window still turned from closed to open every morning at 6 o'clock. The shelving her grandmother built still leaned slightly left. The register still had its own opinions. The floorboard near the door still creaked, second from the entrance, lean right, and the overhead light still buzzed faintly when rain was coming. Everything exactly as it had been. Everything completely changed. Jamila was still standing too, and she had put herself there, through 2 years of invisible, careful, unglamorous survival, through a dialect spoken into her by a woman who understood that language was a form of inheritance, through the decision to answer 7 words in a dying tongue without calculating the consequences first. Her grandmother had kept a promise for 30 years in a small shop that smelled like sesame oil and survival. Jamila thought that was probably the most extraordinary thing she had ever learned about anyone. She intended to be worthy of it.